Excellent, there we go. And I'm going to start by introducing myself, and then I'll share my screen and we'll look through some of the survey results together. And then, like I said, at the end, I have some questions and some thoughts, and hopefully we can participate in a conversation, hear your responses, hear your thoughts, next steps. I'm not great at paying attention to the chat during Zooms, but I'll look at it at the end. And if you have a question that comes up, feel free to share it. Feel free to communicate with each other via the chat. Anything that's useful for you, I'll take a look at it when I'm finished with my slides and see if I can pull some questions out of it. So, hi everybody. I'm Sarah Dziedzic. And I have been doing oral history work for about 13 years. And in that capacity, I've done oral history work in a lot of different positions, mostly as a freelancer, independent contractor, self-employed person, but also for some periods of time as full-time temporary staff. So in all that time, where I work in New York City, I've had an opportunity to work with many, many different kinds of organizations and have experienced a lot of different workplaces, even as I've worked remotely a lot, and have seen some good labor practices and oral history work treated well, and some treatments that were not that great. So over the years, I've talked to a lot of people about these kinds of experiences, and that is one of the big influences for what started this project. So I'm going to share my screen and we will talk about that project in detail. Okay. So the survey is part of the Oral History Practitioner Worker-Led Survey and Solidarity Project. And this project was kind of formulated officially through applying for funding through a program available last year through the Oral History Association and the National Endowment for the Humanities. I was eligible for this funding program, which was for a mini grant because of being underemployed as an oral historian. And it was an independent research project that intended to respond to a few different things that were going on within the larger cultural work sector. So one of the goals of this project was to engage with labor and rights movements that were happening in adjacent fields to oral history that were really being run by cultural workers themselves. And a few that come to mind, a few were really responding to some of the really bad practices happening in museums and concepts of repatriation of objects, but also really bad treatment between leadership and staff and audiences. And then there were some other movements that were emerging around salary and wage transparency, specifically within arts organizations, museums, and also libraries and archives. So this project intended to engage with some of those other movements and other workers. So one of the ways that it intended to do that was to build on some of the existing resources that were being generated by people working in these other fields. And the first part of the project was to curate a resource library that was a place for all of these different resources to exist, and to also open it up for other people to add to that list. So it exists as a spreadsheet that's open that people can add to. It's been open since September. And it also kind of functions as a bibliography for this whole project. So within that library, there are manifestos, networks, publications, recommendations, all kinds of things that are by cultural workers and for cultural workers too. So in a sense, this project also intended to generate something that could be on that list and to also be in dialogue with practitioners across disciplines so that we could be advocating together. Also, the survey aspect responded to some needs that were identified by the Independent Practitioner Task Force of the Oral History Association, which I was co-chair of. And basically, as the task force was generating resources for independent practitioners, we were saying, well, these are some difficult things that independent practitioners encounter, and these are some other challenges that we encounter. And we were saying that as a group of independent practitioners, there are maybe 10 or so of us. And the Oral History Association asked, well, if you're saying that this is common, then where's your data? So it's an important question that needs to be asked. And, we kind of said, well, where is the data? Do you collect the data? So nobody was collecting the data. So this sort of intended to, while it was focusing on labor issues and experiences in the workplace, it also intended to collect some demographic data about people who do oral history. So we're at the third little circle on your screen, which is to activate the results, which is sharing them in public, getting feedback, and also figuring out what to do next. So in addition to this event, there will also be a publication that I'll release next week. And then in October, at the Oral History Association conference in Baltimore, we will have a campfire session to talk further about the results and what to do next, because the final goal is to advocate and support oral history workers and to figure out advocacy campaigns in the future that will respond to some of the data that this survey identified. So a few things about the survey. I created the survey with help from a few peer consultants, a few of whom are here tonight. Ellen Brooks, an oral history practitioner. Hi, Ellen. Catherine Shatsky, an artist and art historian. Elisa Ray Funderburk, Jess Lamar Reese-Holler, and my point person on the grant was Amy Starcheski. Hi, Amy. The survey was open for 12 weeks, and it was open to people who have done any kind of oral history work in any field of practice over the last 5 years, acknowledging that many people work within different fields and oral history work isn't always consistent. So in other words, it was open to people who weren't currently employed doing oral history work. And I sent the survey to members and followers via social media of a number of different organizations, which I will read now. The Oral History Association, the National Council on Public History, American Folklore Society, Society of American Archivists, the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling, Columbia Oral History Master of Arts, National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, American Association for State and Local History, the History Makers, Southwest Oral History Association, New and Emerging Museum Professionals Network, the Oral History Summer School, H Oral Hist on HNet, R Museum Pros on Reddit, and also via the important trifecta of friends, family, and flyers. The survey was anonymous, and it was designed to be a reflective exercise to collect the facts and also feelings and impressions that people have about oral history work and oral history work life. The survey was 8 sections of multiple choice questions and also short answer questions, and it was generated in Google Forms. And as we get into some of the charts that were generated by the survey, a lot of them are offered people the opportunity to check all that apply. So for those of you that listen to numbers really carefully, you'll hear that when I read percentages, they don't necessarily add up to 100 because people are indicating more than one thing because more than one condition applies to them. And there was also a category for other, where people could add in their own response if the choices that I provided weren't adequate to their experience. So we'll see some of that too. There were 114 participants who filled out the survey, and also the survey questions themselves and the responses are available to the public. And I will share a link to those at the end of the presentation tonight. So as we go through, I'll share a couple different excerpts from the survey. So one will be some narrative excerpts from the short answer part of the survey. There'll also be some charts and some numerical data that I'll read out. And then I'll also kind of summarize some of the key points from each section of the survey too. So the first section is who took the survey. So I have a few excerpts here, and I will read out each of these quotes. Quote, "I'm a professor and public historian who works with communities on various projects." Quote, "I'm an oral history consultant and author of a number of books in the field." Quote, "I am an archivist at a federal institution." Quote, "I am a memory worker who uses traditional archives, published materials, and embodied knowledge to provide informational resources for community activists, organizers, and freedom fighters." Quote, "I work at a library in the reference department and also manage the county's local history archival collection." So I asked people, what kinds of oral history work do you do? 91% conduct interviews. 61% manage or support oral histories in archives. 60% teach oral history skills. 57% curate oral histories, and 50% also write about oral history or oral history methodology. 54% transcribe oral histories. And those were the group of most popular activities, and I'll read the rest as well. 41% consult on project design. 22% produce projects for families. 20% produce podcasts or content for radio. 19% produce or facilitate oral tradition. 15% produce documentaries, and 8% create artwork from oral histories. I asked people how to categorize their oral history work, and 48% described their work as limited term project or contract work. 47% described their work as full-time. 26% described their work as part-time. And 20% described their work as unpaid volunteer or intern. 17% said their work was community, artistic, or care-based work, and 4% said they were a paid intern. I also asked, where do you do oral history work? 53% said libraries or archives. 45% college or university department. 32% work in museums. 30% work in community-based nonprofits. 26% work for individuals and private clients. 20% historical societies. 20% unincorporated community groups. 16% federal or state organizations. 11% for-profit businesses. 4% K through 12 schools, 3% research firms, and 2% work in production studios. And I asked people, what fields do you primarily work in or identify with? And I asked people to select up to 3. Oral history was the most popular, 83%. 56% identified archives. 37% said history. 30% said museum, 25% said libraries, 20% said historic preservation, 16% community organizing or activism, 11% anthropology and ethnography, 10% folklore and folklife, 8% radio or podcasting, 8% documentary, 8% art practice, and 5% journalism, and 4% communications. And I think it was my oversight not to include public history on this list. And I think that could have influenced some of the fields that people identified. I also wanted to know what level people worked at. And 52% described their position as mid-level. And 47% described their work as a consultant. So consultants are kind of out of this hierarchy. 21% said they were a director, president, or working in an executive level position. 13% said they were students, interns, or in training. And 12% described their work at an entry-level position. And because this is kind of, in some places it's really clear, in some places it's arbitrary, I also asked, how many years do you have doing oral history work? And 32% said 10 to 20 years, which tracks pretty well with mid-level position. 27% have 5 to 7 years, 17% 2 to 5, and 16% 20 plus. And then 9% were working 1 to 2 years. I also asked people to share their job title where they do oral history work. And I made a word cloud, both because I wanted to see which words came to the front because they were most common, which is the normal reason why you make a word cloud. And then I also perversely wanted to see which words became illegible using this kind of thing. So the most common words, oral historian, makes sense. Archivist, almost equally popular as a job title. Freelance oral historian was next, and oral history consultant a little after that. Also, right in the middle is volunteer. And there's a few other job titles that you can read, probably. Consultant, contractor, curator, historian, editor. But there are a lot of really wonderful, beautiful titles that are extremely hard to read because they only occur once. So it made me think about, how our job titles, if there is an issue with visibility of our work, what role do our job titles play in that? So here's a few takeaways from that segment of the survey. The majority of survey participants work in mid-level positions and or as consultants. There's a nearly even divide between full-time workers and limited-term project workers and contractors. Job titles are overwhelmingly unique, but the most popular titles are oral historian, archivist, and freelance oral historian and oral history consultants. Oral history, archives, history, museums, libraries, and historic preservation were the most popular fields that people practice in. And here's something that I'm still thinking about with regard to this part of the survey. How do our job titles and the way we describe what we do help or hinder the visibility of oral history work to the public and also to other cultural workers? The next section is job and career satisfaction. So I'll read a few quotes from that section. Quote, I enjoy being in a position to lead the strategic planning and the advocacy for my team and our program. It's also really fun to have the authority to say yes to collaborations with community members, artists, and others who come to us with creative ideas. Quote, advancement in my context would result in stopping actively doing the work and instead managing others. While it might pay better, I believe I would derive less satisfaction being in management. Quote, in one of my current positions, I would say the professional level associated with my work is great. But because I'm a lone practitioner, I don't have the support I need. So I'm not satisfied with how my work is understood rather than how it is regarded. Quote, it's a constant struggle for financial support for my work and unfortunate that people are asked to pay for my time instead of being able to do it as part of my university position. This leads to me doing a lot of work as a volunteer. Quote, there is no healthy and just progression of roles that allow for folks to grow professionally and to be appropriately and justly supported. Instead, we have entry jobs, and beyond that, a whole lot of gig economy. So for this section of the survey, I asked for people to rank different statements on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. So think about 5 as like 5 stars. Like it, it's good. I feel intellectually satisfied with my career. 48% said they strongly agree. 37% said they agree. And smaller numbers, I won't read every single number in this section. Smaller numbers are on the disagree part of the scale. I feel emotionally satisfied with my career. 39% strongly agree. 32% agree, and 22% are right in the middle. I feel financially satisfied with my career. On this scale, equal amounts strongly disagree, and are right in the middle, about 25% each. 20% or 19% agree, and only 7% strongly agree that they're financially satisfied with their career. I need more than one job to make ends meet or feel financially secure. 36% strongly agree. On the other end of the scale, 22% strongly disagree, and everyone else was spread in between. I work in multiple fields within the broad cultural work sector. 32% agree, and 28% strongly agree. 18% are right in the middle. And then there's a few 15% that strongly disagree, and 8% that disagree. So the majority of people are working in multiple fields. I feel that the field or fields in which I work offer adequate opportunity for career growth. 30% disagree. 25% are right in the middle. 19% agree. And 13% strongly agree. 12% strongly disagree. I feel supported by coworkers and peers in my field. 36% strongly agree and 36% agree. So overwhelmingly feel supported. I feel supported by supervisors and people in leadership positions in my field. 33% agree and 26% strongly agree. 22% are right in the middle, and 12% disagree, and 7% strongly disagree that they feel supported by supervisors and people in leadership. I have consistently been able to find a job in my field that provides health insurance. 39% strongly disagree, and everyone else is spread out equally across the other parts of the scale. I have consistently been able to find a job in my field that provides retirement benefits. 41% strongly disagree. And again, the responses are spread across the rest of the fields. I have consistently been able to find a job in my field that provides adequate paid time off, such as vacation, parental leave, sick leave. 34% strongly disagree. 21% are right in the middle, and 17% disagree, 17% agree, and 11% strongly agree. So a little bit more availability of paid time off. And then I asked a series of questions that were not mandatory questions, they were optional. If applicable, I have consistently been able to find work that honors accessibility accommodations for my disability. 47% chose right in the middle of the scale. 22% strongly disagree. 10% disagree, 10% agree, and 10% strongly agree. If applicable, I have consistently been able to find work that enables me to resolve my student loan debt through repayment and/or forgiveness programs. 36% strongly disagree. 28% are right in the middle, and 19% disagree. 10% agree, and 7% strongly agree. I feel that my career has enabled me to have a good quality of life. 36% are right in the middle, 30% agree, 19% strongly agree, 12% disagree, and 3% strongly disagree. So some takeaways from the job and career satisfaction part of the survey. Most survey respondents feel intellectually and emotionally satisfied with their career. It's great. Financial satisfaction is low, with over a third of workers saying they need more than one job to feel financially secure or make ends meet. Most people feel supported by peers, supervisors, and leaders in their field. Another good thing. People have struggled with jobs not offering health insurance, retirement benefits, and adequate time off. Many are not satisfied with opportunities for career growth. Disability accommodations and loan forgiveness options are hard to find in the available jobs for those who need them. So I'm still thinking about that quality of life question, where participants kind of said what I have subtitled, okay, I guess. So meaningful and satisfying work isn't enough to overcome financial insecurity and the lack of benefits. Experiences in the workplace is the next section, and I'll read a few excerpts. Quote, I often feel I have to choose between being out about my gender identity, important for me being an ally to other queer and trans folks, and especially youth in my community, or my employment / the mission of my organization. Quote, the university is completely focused on student accommodation and provides no guidance on how to talk to students about accommodations you may need from them or your teaching accommodations from the university that may impact the running of class on schedule. Quote, I witnessed racist, patronizing practices and was subjected to sexist attitudes that shaped the work, but most of the time, I, a woman, was the only one speaking up, so I was called emotional. Quote, the organization as a whole operated on a basis of exploitation of people of color internally, but kept gaining grants to work with people of color because of their public optics. Quote, I made it a point to conceal any personal information about myself whenever possible. Quote, I am hearing lots of ableist terms about mental health and illness. So I asked people if they had experienced bad or discriminatory treatment in the workplace. And 74% said no, and 26% said yes. I asked about the basis of that discriminatory treatment, and 43% said gender identity. 24% said disability or medical condition, 16% said race, 16% said class, 14% said ethnicity, 11% said color, 8% said sexuality, and 8% said religion. And participants also used that other field to note that they had experienced bad or discriminatory treatment based on age and also parenthood. And parenthood due to having children and parenthood due to not having children, depending on the context. And I asked, did you speak out about this bad treatment? 29% said yes, and it was not adequately addressed. 23% said, no, I didn't feel it would be helpful. 17% said yes, and I was retaliated against. 14% said no, I didn't know what to say. And 9% said yes, and it was adequately addressed. So pretty bleak. I also asked about struggles due to lack of options relating to a series of different issues. 49%, the majority, said burnout. 26% said mental health. 20% said caregiving responsibilities. 19% said evolving or chronic medical conditions. 13% said sick days related to COVID-19. 11% said bereavement. 9% said disability. And another 9% said housing crises, including having to move suddenly. 4% said language and interpretation, and 3% said cultural practices based on religion. So I want to share some demographic information so that we can think about this as we look back at the last few slides. I asked, what is your racial identity? And 75% said white, which is the overwhelming majority. 9% said Black or African American. 7% said Latino or Hispanic. 7% said Asian. 3% said 2 or more races. 1% said Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. 1% said unknown. And 0% said Native American or Alaska Native. So when I saw that 75% of the people who took the survey were white, I looked back at that pie chart of who had experienced discrimination, and I thought, if all the people who are not experiencing discrimination are white, then we have a problem. If all of the 26% of people who are reporting incidences of discrimination at work are the people who identified a race other than white, then we have a much bigger problem than 26%. So I looked back at the data of people who had identified as races other than white, and discrimination was reported by people across all racial identities. And it was not an issue overwhelmingly reported by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The same with gender. 75% of people identify as female, and 18% identify as male. 4% identify as non-binary. 3% said 3% said femme. 3% genderqueer. 1% transmasc, 1% gender nonconforming, 1% agender, and 1% preferred not to say. So I also went back to that data and looked at who reported incidences of discrimination to kind of make sure that it wasn't all the people who identify as non-binary experiencing different forms of discrimination, and it wasn't. It was reported by people across all genders, and was not overly reported by people who are non-binary. So that still leaves us with the reality that 75% of the people who took the survey are white, and 75% of the people who took the survey are women. So this brings up one of the things that I mentioned at the very beginning, which is that without a kind of baseline data or demographic data about who are oral history practitioners, it's difficult to know if the survey was overwhelmingly filled out by people who are female and white, or whether that is somehow representative of the makeup of the field. A few takeaways from this part of the survey. A quarter of participants have experienced discriminatory treatment in the workplace. Discrimination due to gender, disability, race, and class were most common. People also struggled with burnout, mental health, caregiving responsibilities, and evolving or chronic medical conditions, issues that are likely interrelated and impact home and work. Demographic data about oral history workers as a whole is necessary to understand this as a sample, in quotes. Regardless, we should think further about the presence and visibility of white women in this field. So some things I'm still thinking about. As this project moves into a more participatory phase, how can it become more inclusive? What labor is collaborative? What labor is reparative and the responsibility of white people of settler descent? This next section is about compensation for oral history work. There are two sections about money, compensation, this one, and the next one is budget. A few excerpts. Quote, all of these tasks have to happen within the normal salary range and time of my job. There is no extra compensation for oral history work. Quote, an oral historian needs to be fully funded, but at my place of work, it is not. Only based on grant funds for specific projects. Very Band-Aid and not future thinking. Quote, not applicable. Quote, I get paid well, above living wage, for my current contract position, but I don't work enough hours a week on that job, which is currently my only income, to meet a living wage. Quote, the majority of oral history work I do outside of my full-time archives job, where I preserve and catalog, is volunteer work, all done for free. Quote, I wish grantors would consider giving money to individual oral historians. Quote, it is usually seen as a fun add-on, not real work. Ouch. So I asked people how they were paid for their oral history work, and 52% said salary. 28% said they were paid an hourly rate. 24% said they were paid a flat rate per deliverable, invoiced periodically. 22% are not paid. 15% are paid upon full completion of a project, and 13% are paid a stipend, for example, transportation costs or materials costs. Some participants also noted that they were paid by grants and also via teaching jobs where oral history was part of the course. And I asked people how much do they earn specifically from oral history work. 33% earn less than $10,000, and that is the largest category. And I asked about this in increments of $10,000 the whole way up to $100,000 and more, and they're all somewhat equal. About 30% earn between $10,000 and $50,000 a year, and another 30% earn over $50,000 a year. But that largest category is still less than 10,000. And then I asked for the salary for full-time oral history work, if that applied to the places where people work. And 60% said not applicable. 14% said $55,000 to $64,000 a year. And this is both in the middle of the range and also the most common. And the salaries sort of trickle up to $95,000 and above and trickle down to less than $25,000 a year. And I also, on this slide, included some of the comments that people wrote in the other category, where people say, I don't know, I used to work here, I'm not sure, It varies, and so on and so forth. And then I asked about people's total income from cultural work. So before it was just oral history work, and this is from total cultural work. And this is like a perfect little pizza pie sliced almost evenly. And again, I asked about people's income in increments of $10,000, everywhere from between less than $10,000 the whole way up to 100,000 plus. And it's fairly even. The most common income was $50,000 to $60,000, followed by $40,000 to $50,000, and $30,000 to $40,000. So those are the most common ranges. So again, a few pieces of demographic information as we try to make sense of some of this data. I asked where people were based. 39% live in the northeastern United States. 21% live in the Southeast, 16% in the West, 12% in the Midwest, 7% in the Southwest, 4% in Canada. And then there were 6% that lived outside of North and Central America. And they lived in Australia or Oceania, Europe, South America, Pacific Islands, Hawaii, and a few other people who worked in numerous places. So in order to kind of ground people's salary and income with and match that to where they lived and the cost of living, I asked for people to say whether their income was commensurate with the cost of living where they were based. And 50% said yes, and basically 50% said no. If you're looking at the screen and you see the chart, you see it's 41% said no, but you'll see there's many other entries that people have added that more or less say no. So I read this as 50% their income is commensurate with the cost of living, and 50% it's not. So a few takeaways on compensation. A third of participants earn less than $10,000 a year for their oral history work, and a fifth conduct this work unpaid. Reported total incomes are almost evenly distributed between $0 and $100,000, question mark, exclamation point. Half of participants say their income is in line with cost of living, and half say it's not. $55,000 to $64,000 a year is the median and the most common salary reported for full-time oral history work, where that work exists. This data will not give us a baseline for salary. There's too many variations, too many questions. But I think what this data shows is that there's little guidance on salary and pay, and it indicates a need for a baseline that's informed not by averages, but by skills, experience, and cost of living. So I'm still thinking about the fact that some oral history workers are doing okay, and some are in crisis, and some, as they indicated in the comments, flip-flop between okay and crisis as income fluctuates. So how do we work towards more economic sustainability in a field where volunteer is so prominent in our titles? Think about that word cloud. And a fifth of people, quote unquote, work for free. Oral history budgeting. This is the next section. And here's a few excerpts. Quote, it varies a lot, and maybe this survey can result in some benchmark fee rates for various oral history tasks. Quote, not applicable. Quote, funders in my industry in my state won't fund raw oral history work. There needs to be a public component, exhibit, festival, book at the end of it. So those things always end up in the same budget and vampirize each other. Quote, Outreach and marketing are a cost, exclamation point. Quote, I have never had an employer who understood how much work goes into transcription, and rarely have I had one that was able to appreciate this even after multiple explanations. Quote, complicated. Want to compensate narrator's time, but I don't have funding even for myself. Quote, narrators and interviewees should be given the compensation they deserve for sharing and offering life stories. Cultural taxation is a real thing and should be considered. So I asked for people to weigh in on a few different things that I thought of as common oral history tasks with regard to how these things were either budgeted for where they work, or the fees that people charged if they were consultants, or the fees and rates that they're paid. And if you're looking at the screen, you can see that about 15 people, I think, used the other space to kind of qualify whatever they were saying or input some other text to say, you know, it varies, I don't know, it's this, it's that, it changes, I'm not sure, etc. But the majority of people say not applicable, 35%. 22% said $200 to $500 a session. 13% said $500 to $800 a session. 18% said $0 to $200 a session. 8% said $800 to $1,100 a session. 3% said $1,100 to $1,400, and 2% said more than $1,400. So as I read through these comments, I realized that not applicable here could mean a number of things, and I had no idea which. It could mean we don't compensate this labor, $0. It could mean this labor is part of my salary, and we don't itemize work this way. Or it could mean I don't know, and I'm not sure. I also asked for the fee or budgeted cost for oral history project management, which is something that I, for example, am often hired to do. And I see jobs for this here and there. 40% said not applicable. 14% said $20 to $30 an hour. 13% said $30 to $40 an hour. 10% said $40 to $50 an hour. 8% said $0 to $20 an hour. 7% said more than $60 an hour, and 6% said $50 to $60 an hour. People also added in over $150 an hour, $75 an hour, $100 an hour, many different things. So numbers are going to vary widely based on whether people are salaried or contractors. So how do we make sense of all these things together? I also asked for fee or budgeted cost for transcription. 44% said not applicable. 11% said $0 to $1 per recorded minute. 11% said $1.76 to $2 per recorded minute. 7% said $1.50 to $1.75. 6% said $1.26 to $1.50. 6% said $1 to $1.25. And 10% said more than $2. And there were various other descriptions in the other section, including the fact that people, when they do transcribe, create many different kinds of formats of transcription. They index, they summarize, and some rely on software. So making the per recorded minute option obsolete or not applicable. So some takeaways from the budgeting section. The design of the survey did not allow for clear data on oral history budgets. Not applicable should not be the most common response. I knew that it would be hairy, but I had no idea how hairy it would be. If people don't budget using the elements listed in the survey, what numbers are people using? I'm pretty sure people still budget using numbers, or am I wrong? Standards for different systems of operation are needed for people working with contractor rates, staff salaries, software, and grants. Even while oral history work happens in various places and spaces, we need a suite of equitable models where no element of labor equals $0. So something I'm still thinking about is that best practices for oral history support product and process. But can there also be a best practice to materially support the people doing the work? Advocating for ourselves and advocating for the people we interview is not mutually exclusive. And this is the last section of results I'm going to share, ranking interest in workplace issues. Quote, "What's needed is more and more central resources to support living wages and recognition of the types of labor performed in oral history, intellectual, emotional, etc., and how this relates to historic intersectional discrimination and correspondingly low pay and recognition and the recompense that is merited today." Quote, "Burnout prevention by addressing workload issues would be important." Quote, "My concern with advocacy within institutional workplaces is that it often overburdens staff and puts the problems on the shoulders of each person, where we just need more education and to speak up more, rather than initiating actual dismantling of the hierarchies and colonialist culture." So I'd ask people to gauge their interest in a number of different issues, initially on a scale, again, with 1 being low interest and 5 being high interest. And everybody was fully interested almost in all of these issues, which I asked about individually. And this chart is asking for people to rank their interest in all of these issues. And I asked people to select up to 5. So the number 1 issue that people indicated was creation of permanent jobs, 71%. 68% said burnout prevention. 61% said diversity, equity, and inclusion resources. 55% said pay transparency. And 42% said conflict navigation. And those were the top 5. But people were still also very interested in the other issues, which I'll also read. 38% said anti-discrimination education and resources. 31% said unionization efforts. 25% said disability accommodations. Where am I on my list? 24% said caregiver accommodations. 20% said debt and financial education. And 19% said language justice. So takeaways from ranking workplace issues. Participants overwhelmingly expressed support for all the issues included in the survey. The top 5 were 1, creation of permanent jobs, 2, burnout prevention, 3, DEI strategies, 4, pay transparency, and 5, conflict navigation strategies. The issues that ranked less high are priorities for a meaningful number of participants. Participants want actual structural change and are weary of models that rely only on trainings and self-education that put the burden for change on individual workers. So I'm still thinking about, do we have all the data that we need? Are we ready to use this data to prioritize issues in future advocacy campaigns? So these are my just final thoughts and questions, and we can either use them to begin our discussion together, or folks can ask their own questions. But I'll read all these out and we can start our discussion in a few minutes. 1, While our work is satisfying by some important measures, there are financial strains and workload issues that make quality of life iffy for many of us. In the interest of solidarity, where do we target our energies to improve each other's quality of life? 2, oral history workers want permanent, sustainable jobs. What are the steps of a campaign to achieve this goal with respect to the gig economy, the amount of volunteer labor that exists, scarcity in public history and the humanities, etc.? Pay transparency is supported. Acknowledging that contractors and salaried people are paid differently, what kinds of resources could be helpful and applicable to both? How does pay transparency support improving quality of life? 4, how do we mobilize the goals and spirit of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility to make structural change? And what amount of individual work is the ongoing, lifelong responsibility of white people? 5, what kind of advocacy is the responsibility of an institution, such as a professional association, a university program or department, a nonprofit, or another organization? And what kind of advocacy should be worker-led? And 6, how do we build more opportunities that provide funding to individual oral historians that compensate labor, hours, and where applicable, the people we interview, and not just materials, equipment, and travel? So that is all of my talking. And I'd like to hear if anybody has questions or comments or wants to take on any of these questions that I've left us with. Feel free to unmute. I think we're a small enough group for that, actually. And in the meantime, we'll check the chat. Yeah, if anyone wants to take on what not applicable means or share what kind of numbers do people use when they're budgeting, aside from some of the ones that I shared, I would be happy to hear it.
I have a question, Sarah.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is amazing. What an incredible resource. And I'm curious because this was done in part building on and in relation to cultural worker organizing in other fields. Do you have a sense of like how this compares to what people are finding in other cultural worker fields and what pieces of this are most specific to oral history? Because I think that can help us think about where we want to be allying with other cultural workers that are already organizing and where we want to be working kind of more within the field of oral history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just read a blog post from a librarian where they were talking about a lot of library work as essentially dead-end work because so much of the work is there's not a lot of opportunity for change or job growth. And so people kind of get stuck doing the same things. So even though people might be paid well, the amount of education that they have to get in order to do work that isn't actually intellectually engaging is really out of sync. So, so it's almost like every field that I'm aware of has some component, but it isn't exactly the same. So another thing is that archivists have done a lot of organizing around, specifically around the creation of permanent jobs, and have written some worker-generated reports about how difficult it is to go from temporary job to temporary job to temporary job. A lot of people who work in academia will talk about this, that you travel and you go where the jobs are. but it also really impacts project archivists. So I think that there's a lot there where there could be allyship. There is something unique, though, about the way in which a lot of people have, indicated through the survey around satisfaction that the work is meaningful. But the quality of life is not great. So I think that there's really a lack of models. People aren't just going off of models for different archivist jobs or library jobs or museum jobs. I think a lot of jobs evolve to include oral history, and so they become really out of sync with the kind of special skills that a lot of us have. So. I'll also add that I was part of a working group through the National Council on Public History, where we talked about what are and the working group was specifically related to labor organizing and labor rights in the field of oral history, or in the field of public history, which of course includes many different people practicing in different kinds of places and spaces and fields and positions and so on. And there were a number of things that came up that were that I'd never thought of before that I thought were really significant. So, for example, a lot of people who do public history work work in a place with an extremely small staff where there's no HR department. So when people have issues around interpersonal issues with other colleagues or with need disability accommodations, for example, there is no policy. There is nothing to go to. There's no one to ask. There's no one to talk to. So we talked about the possibility of having some kind of standard form that people could, that anybody's boss anywhere could kind of print off and see, okay, this is what happens when somebody who works here has a disability accommodation request, even though we don't have an HR department. So there's some things that are just, if you can prevent people from panicking or Googling and supply that resource that people are saying they need, I do see that there's little avenues for things like that. Someone had asked if I had done interviews to supplement this. I haven't. There were just some short answer questions in the survey, and people used, I also ended each section by saying something like, if there's anything I haven't asked you about, please feel free to share it, which oral historians will recognize that question, and people use that space. I mean, in some cases, people wrote like pages and pages. So that's where these excerpts come from. But I do want to say that there is, the Oral History Association is doing an equity audit. And part of that, I'm not involved with it, but I do know that part of it is a survey and part of it is also interviews with people about their experiences. And so part of me wonders in the future if there can be a way to kind of combine these results together. I'm not sure if anyone is here who is part of that equity audit. But if there is, feel free to speak up.
Hey, Sarah, this is Ellen.
Hey, Ellen.
Hi. Sorry. As part of those short answer or long answer in some case questions, I feel like I remember you asking folks if you could follow up with them if they were okay with that. So like you could get long, like, you could get more formal answers, or does that ring a bell?
At the very end of the survey, I had kind of said, feel free to get in touch if you want to. And a few people did either reach out that way or reached out via other formats, contacted me in different ways. Some people put their contact information just in those responses. But there wasn't a formal way to say, stay connected.
Okay.
And I thought a lot about that because, I wanted this project to be emergent, meaning that each part of it responded to the part prior. And that meant that I didn't know exactly what was going to happen as I looked ahead. And it made it a little bit more difficult for me to offer clear opportunities for people to participate. And the other thing is that I prioritized the survey being anonymous, which meant that it did not collect email addresses. But I kind of wonder in retrospect, would there have been more people who would have preferred to be able to, for example, get their responses emailed to them and to stay in touch so I could share results? Then there would have been who would have said, like, you're collecting my email address? No way. So those are some self-critiques as I look back on certain aspects of the project. But there's a little button I haven't clicked yet on Google Forms that says publish analytics. And based on my own Googling, that may or may not send copies of the results to people who took the survey. So maybe I'll do that after I leave tonight, and you'll see if you get an email. So I see in the chat, Benji, who's on the Equity Audit Task Force, says, I'm not able to speak right now, but definitely support the idea of synergizing our efforts. Great. Let's plan that. Oh, yes. I think you're right, Ellen. Yes, exactly. The equity audit included an option to follow up to offer to be interviewed. Because the things that people shared in, especially in response to a question I asked about how would you describe the work that you do, those responses were so amazing to read, and felt like sometimes some of us, I think, struggle to describe what we do to people who maybe aren't familiar. And the responses to that question were so clear and so amazing that I do want to release all of those short descriptions in some other simple format, because it feels like whatever work we might do to promote the creation of future jobs or better jobs should kind of be built on that, what people are already doing. Amy, I see your hand.
Thank you. One thing I'm thinking about is the question of which pieces of this advocacy should be worker-led, which should be responsibility of an institution. And like one piece that the OHA or other oral history institutions might be able to support is the DEI education and conflict resolution training. That those seem like the kinds of tools that could be sort of centrally developed and widely shared and that could come from or through institutions. So I'm curious what other people think about that, but I'm trying to think about pieces of this that could be broken out and tackled in different spaces. And I know that's something that we've already been talking about within the OHA, both of those two things.
Yeah, thank you. There were a few people in the comments who basically said, my institution is already working on generating resources around, anti-discrimination or DEI, DEIA. So maybe oral history folks should focus on some of the other elements or something like that. But I think that might be true for larger institutions. But for those of us who work in places where there's one paid staff or two or three, I think there's an assumption that the work doesn't need to happen. One thing I was kind of surprised about that's related to this is a lot of people said, in response to some questions about, there was a segment of questions that I asked in the survey that I didn't share tonight about how do you feel about, your workplace's diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, and how do you feel about their actions? Are they in alignment? And a lot of people said, I work by myself, so that not applicable. And it made me think about how even if we work by ourselves, it's still important for a lot of us, especially people who are white or able-bodied, to be informed of these things and to have a set of policies outlined for ourselves as we move through different spaces, interview different people, work with different people, teach different people, etc. So, that was something that struck me. I was like, hey, I have, I think something that a lot of us, that came to the fore in 2020 was if you don't have anti-racist policies, then you're probably acting in a way that's harmful or racist. So, I took that to mean that it's my responsibility, even if I'm a business of one person, to be clear about how I operate. Because I know that especially when I get, for example, really burned out, I totally, forget how to behave. So it is helpful for me in the way I operate to have guidance on everything from here's how you prioritize your tasks to here's how you respond to a meeting request when you're tired. And none of that is intentional. It's just a result of being so exhausted and overworked. And, again, like, it doesn't matter what the intention is, it matters what the impact is. And it's helpful for me to outline all of those things for myself so that I can be a little bit more confident about my potential impact when I lose the ability to make those decisions. Jess.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. And thank you, Sarah. This is huge and so important. And I think the ways that responses were confusing or maybe not what was expected are so important for advocacy too. I think my question is, I want to think back to this moment where we were looking at the, how much people charge per session if they do, or what we make. And you had said something really important about how do we organize based on setting baselines for salary or for pay or for, what should be the acceptable bare minimum budgeted rate for an oral history session based on skills and experience and other contextual factors and not based on averages. And my question is, as you prepare to have your white paper go live and publish either results or some portion of this data, how do we prevent institutions from looking at this data as a race to the bottom? Because I think about those of us who were involved in the Independent Practitioners Task Force, how hard some of us have had to fight to push for $1,000 as a baseline for an interview session. And I think about the part of the country I'm working in, and if someone looked at this and said, well, the majority are charging $100, $200, you need to change your whole model. I was just curious what thoughts are. I know none of us in this space and interested in organizing will push for that sort of thing, but we know, I think in neoliberal austerity economies, hiring institutions may. So I was just curious what your thoughts are, Sarah, on plans around some of that data and how to prevent it from being misused as a race to the bottom.
Yeah. My immediate thought was that, well, first of all, it would have been better to have the survey kind of bifurcate into different sections based on, whether people are working in a salaried space or whether people are working independently. And I think, Ellen, you had suggested that. That was a great idea. Because I think that what we really need is data coming from different kinds of places. When I look at this data, I don't really even see how to do the math. And that's kind of why I shared some of those pieces of information with all those other categories listed for some of the other charts. I just cut it off so that we could be clear in what we were looking at. But for the budgets, it just was like chaos and confusion in the comments. And so I think, all I can do is kind of hope to say, like, not applicable is not a number. And so you can't put that into an equation to do some kind of math to come up with some sort of average. So, I mean, that's kind of all I can say. I mean, for me, when I look at it, it's sort of like too broken to do the math. And I think the answer to this question has to be math. So, but maybe that's being short-sighted. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, if we think about, cultural work income, if people are like between $55,000 and $65,000 a year, it's not the worst place for people to start. It is not commensurate with the cost of living in many places, but I think when I look at that chart, I also see something is out of whack. And again, in the comments, people had said, this year is one thing and next year is going to be something totally different. And in fact, there were a few people who filled out the survey who had received the Oral History Association and a NEH fellowship, and kind of said, well, this year I'm making, I think the stipend or the fellowship award was $60,000. So suddenly I'm making $60,000 and I'm answering with that, but next year it could be zero. So it's just not something where you can average. The average is not a meaningful number. If anybody else has thoughts on how to avoid that, I'd be happy to hear it. It did kind of make me think about how surveys are maybe not going to work for this. But that potentially what could happen is a dedicated conversation at different museums or university departments or research centers where oral history work is done, where there are numbers, and to think about, here's one organization, who are its peers, what are we looking at? Do you like these numbers? And how do we kind of publish them and use that as a baseline? So in other words, maybe more of a conversation where you can kind of look at the numbers together and say, yes, this is right. But actually my suspicion is that a lot of people just get added on work. I mean, that happens, I think, across the board. They're asked to do more, and the time and the labor and the costs, financial costs that go along with that are not tabulated at all. So my sense was, let's tabulate it, let's release some tabulations, and let's draw a baseline from there.
I feel like another useful piece of information would be to ask people in future surveys or in any way how many hours of work they think an oral history session takes. Because I think that kind of information could help to show if these show that these rates are not sustainable, right? So to be able to say, like, yes, people are charging $200 for an oral history, it means they're getting paid below minimum wage, right? And so that is an easy way to say, like, that number is not acceptable or not sustainable. Yeah, there is actually, while doing this, I came across another resource from the Kentucky Oral History Commission for pricing for their oral history grants. And I actually kept misreading the numbers to be hourly when they were singular amounts because they were so low. So that exists already. So the bottom is out there. People are already getting paid $0. So if we can say 200 to 500, that is an improvement from what's out there. But I think more than anything else, I just kind of see this as a little bit of chaos. Jess is asking about what % of people's income comes from other places entirely, such as jobs outside of cultural work, partners, inheritance, etc.
I believe the question I asked wasn't total household income, but total income from cultural work. So potentially that might not have included some of those other things. There were a small number of people that did work outside of the cultural work field as one of their jobs. Well, folks, if we're at the end of our questions, then potentially we can break. Last thoughts. Thanks everybody so much. Thank you for the OHA for hosting this and for consideration of this grant and getting this grant. And thanks for everybody who filled out the survey and participated in this, listened in. I hope your meals are delicious. And if you would like to stay in touch, my contact information is here, and there's also a link that you can follow to see some of the results in Google Drive. And like I said, next week there will be a publication that is in the style of a white paper describing a problem and making recommendations. So I think it will be a lot less of the raw numbers and more of a narrative description of some of the issues that I'm drawing from the numbers and specific recommendations. So should feel different from what we looked at tonight. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.